So I was sick of the truck being broken all the time, or at least feeling like it was broken. It ran and drove, but there were enough little things wrong with it to keep you from using the thing when you needed it. And for years, well, I was sick of that stuff hanging over my head. So I said, screw it, let's put some time in, get those nagging problems fixed, and then the truck will be a source of joy instead of stress. So first up was the tailgate. The swivel hinges had rusted to the point of crumbling and no longer held the tailgate on anymore. So Malcolm and I started by removing the pivots from the truck bed. Then I cleaned off the rust and residue trap behind those pivot brackets, and I reinstalled the new ones. These new brackets are solid metal instead of a circle of sheet metal, so they shouldn't be so vulnerable to inevitable rust. Sadie inspected progress at this point and thought things were looking good. It was her idea to take her shoes off. Then I removed the pivot brackets from the tailgate, cleaned the surfaces, and reinstalled the new brackets there as well. I reinstalled the tailgate, and it swiveled nicely, so that was great. But it had been sitting for quite a while, and now it wouldn't latch. It sounds like that's a common problem with these tailgate handle mechanisms. Eventually they rust up and won't operate the latch anymore. So I took off the old handle. These red and green plastic pieces swivel onto the rods that operate the latches. The old one indeed was pretty rusty, especially when compared to the new one. So I installed the replacement. And the latch worked again. It was still a little jiggly though. I noticed that the plastic sleeves on the tailgate striker bolts were pretty worn out, so I replaced them to see if it would help. And it really did help. The tailgate now locked like new. Not a bit of jiggling. While I was working on the tailgate, I decided to take care of what I would loosely consider a problem with most old vehicles. It didn't have a backup camera. And to have a backup camera, you need a monitor in the cab, so I also decided to install a CarPlay stereo as well to allow me to use my phone as a radio for even more safety. I started by wiring up the stereo wiring harness.
Dang it! There.
Then I covered the butt connectors with heat shrink tubing. I took off the dash. And I pulled out the old stereo.
Whoa, there we go.
Then I installed the new one to test it to make sure it worked. A fun fact is that I bought this stereo back in 2022 and only now just got it installed.
Sweet.
Now it was time for the backup camera itself. I started by tapping a wire into the reverse lights to power up the camera anytime I shifted into reverse. I think I had to move my tapped wire over to the green wire instead of the black one for the record, so don't use this as your tutorial. Then I ran a fish wire down through the tailgate. This was a bear to get it to feed correctly through the channels in there. I removed the glue from the old tailgate handle trim cover, which fell off in my garage years ago. These plastic razor blades were a big help. I taped the wires from the camera to my fishing wire and pulled them down through.
Whew, thank goodness.
Then I stuck the handle trim cover to the tailgate. Underneath the truck, I plugged the camera into the longer connector wire and zip tied those to wherever convenient points I could find along the bottom of the truck all the way up to the front of the cab. I lifted up the floor mat and stabbed a Duresta ice pick through the wire transfer membrane on the floor of the truck. Then I taped the connector wire to that and pulled it through. In retrospect, I shouldn't have used the ice pick for this because I almost stabbed myself when trying to jam the wire through. I should have just used a coat hanger or something like others have suggested. But this still worked. I used my fish wire from the tailgate again to pull the connector wire through the dash and into the radio cavity. This really wasn't fun, but it eventually worked.
Got it. I ended up putting a loop on the end of it, jamming the wire up the back, and then kind of wiggling it around back and forth, and eventually I could see it behind the instrument panel.
I then discovered my radio was too deep to fit with some of the plastic in the back behind the dash, so I marked it and cut it out with an oscillating saw. It's unnerving modifying the truck like this, but you gotta do that sometimes.
Sweet!
And I screwed a ground wire into the metal frame. Speaking of modifications, I wanted to be able to power off or restart the stereo if I needed to. And modern stereos don't seem to let you completely power themselves down without turning off the whole car itself. So I drilled a hole into this empty dash piece and I installed an on-off switch.
Oh, sweet.
I ran the microphone through this random empty ceiling space. Then I plugged everything back in and validated that it all still worked. It looked good, so I installed the new replacement dash, which is custom made to fit modern stereo sizes. Then I tested it out again, and it all still worked. I absolutely love being able to see what's behind this big truck when I back up now. With that, it was back to more critical, actually broken stuff. The serpentine belt had been squeaking for quite a while, which meant it's probably worn out. This belt connects the engine with critical things like the water pump, so you don't want it breaking on you out on the road. I took some things out to make it easier to get at the belt, but I left the coolant fan area alone because I didn't want to mess with it, and this decision probably made the rest of my job harder. When I started removing the belt, there was barely enough room to fit the tools in, but I eventually got it out.
Wheel.
While I was there, I also removed the belt tensioner.
Here's the old one. Here's the new one.
That new one definitely was a lot quieter, so I was glad I decided to replace it. I similarly removed the old idler pulley, which is a pulley that doesn't hook up to anything but just sits and spins.
Sweet!
And I hit a slight snag at this point.
This seems different. Problem is, this fits down snug in there. Red's on top on there. Maybe I don't need it?
But some Googling suggested that this difference was fine, so I crossed my fingers and installed a new one. Then it was time for the new belt. This process is always intimidating because you gotta interpret some MC Escher level belt diagram and hope you don't put it back on wrong. But I am guessing it's physically impossible to do that because of the spaces between pulleys and the length of the belt and all that, so it's Probably a job that seems more intimidating than it really is. Either way, it's still a mind-bending experience. It's always good when it's over.
Done!
And with that, the belt was back on, and it sounded much better. Back inside the truck, this curled-up floor mat had been catching my foot for as long as I owned the truck. I thought about buying a new one, but I figured I should see if I could get this one to flatten out instead. So I hit it with the heat gun, then I weighed it down with a weight while it cooled. That worked surprisingly well, but it was taking a while, so I hit it again, this time with a bigger heat gun.
Oh, he's melting. Sweet.
And that was the ticket. This worked way better than I expected. No more catching my foot on this thing every time I get into the truck. And last fix for this video, the mirrors had never worked. The problem from this could have been a lot of things, but one of the easier possible fixes was if the mirror switch was just bad. So I took that apart, replaced the old one with a new one. And what do you know, the mirrors worked for the first time that I had ever seen them. Movable mirrors, what a leap forward in technology. I'll stop here for now, but there's still more to come. Thanks for watching.